Charles Manson and his so-called family would become the most infamous killers of the 20th century,
The victims died in the worst way.
committing a series of brutal and seemingly senseless crimes that would spell the end of the 1960s hippie dream.
They were vicious. I mean, just horrible killings. I mean, it's multiple stabbing while people are begging for their lives.
But what made Manson the man he was?
He was a very powerful person. When he said jump, they jumped.
How did so many young people fall under his spell?
Charlie would talk about how he was Jesus and the devil all in one.
And were Manson and his followers born to kill?
August 8th, 1969, I was a Los Angeles police officer working West Los Angeles Division, and I received a radio call at about 9 o'clock in the morning of a man down at Cielo Drive. I wasn't expecting what I saw when I got to that house.
In a scene described by one investigator as reminiscent of a weird religious rite, 5 persons, including actress Sharon Tate, were found dead at the home of Miss Tate and her husband, screen director Roman Polanski. Miss Tate was 8 months pregnant.
I was the first one there. When I entered the house, everybody was dead. The word pig written on the front door in somebody's blood. It was very gruesome.
Detective Sergeant Mike McGann was assigned the case.
When I arrived on the scene, there was some wires that were cut over a large gate. I entered the driveway and found a car parked about center driveway, which contained Stephen Parent.
18-year-old Stephen Parent had been leaving after a visit to the property's caretaker.
And I went inside and I discovered Sharon Tate and Jay Sebring.
26-year-old Sharon Tate had been renting the Bel Air home. Celebrity hairdresser Jay Sebring had been visiting the 8.5-month pregnant actress.
Sharon was terribly stabbed, and they were tied together with a rope which was tossed over a rafter in the house. I continued on through the back door, and I found Abigail Folger.
25-year-old coffee heiress Abigail Folger was a house guest of the Polanskis.
Abigail had been stabbed numerous times. She was very bloodied and obviously dead. And I also found Wojciech Frykowski.
Folger's lover, Frykowski, was a friend of Polanski from Poland.
Wojciech had also been struck with the gun that they used. It was a terrible scene. I had been working homicide for a long time, so I had seen a lot of scenes, but I don't think any quite as bad as this one.
Polanski was in Europe at the time. Of course, he dashed back when he found out that his young pregnant wife had been murdered, and held probably one of the most moving news conferences, by the way, that I've ever attended. The man was just a wreck.
The house is open now. You see a lot of blood all over the place. Cradles, baby clothes, and that's all.
Of course, the husband can be a suspect, and so we wanted to talk to Roman, and he agreed to take a polygraph the next morning at our crime lab. And I was there with a polygraph examiner. He passed with flying colors. There was no question he was not part of the homicide.
Nobody knew who did it. Nobody had a clue, and Hollywood just went nuts. People were buying guard dogs, and they were buying guns.
Oh, LA panicked. All these movie stars, they were hiring guards and off-duty police, anybody that they could get to their house. I mean, it was a complete panic in the Hollywood area.
And the next night, the killing continued. Businessman Tate-LaBianca and his wife Rosemary were stabbed to death in their home. Again, messages were written in blood.
After the LaBiancas were murdered the next day, it really started hot and heavy.
There was a lot of fear and paranoia here in LA, particularly in the movie colony. Why? Well, not just because the murders were incredibly gruesome, a total of 169 stab wounds, but they seemed to be random.
Despite a massive police operation, investigators were unable to identify a perpetrator.
We did everything we do. I mean, we had everybody we could possibly think of working on the case, doing every possible thing. Every lead we had, we exhausted.
Then, 3 months after the murders, detectives got word that a young Californian girl had made an extraordinary jailhouse confession. A story so strange, it was almost unbelievable.
It was a crazy story. Yeah, it was very crazy. Susan was the nicest person you ever want to meet. Talking to her in that period of time, you would think it was impossible. I mean, she was just a very nice young lady.
21-year-old Susan Atkins had claimed to cellmates that she and a group of her friends were responsible for the terrible crimes.
If these were typical murderer types, or robbers, or rapists, or burglars, it wouldn't have been quite as shocking. But they started looking at the backgrounds of these people.
Most of them came from good middle-class families in the suburbs.
Leslie Van Houten was a homecoming queen. Tex Watson was a star athlete.
Patricia Krenwinkel sang in the church choir. At one time, she wanted to become a nun.
These seemingly all-American kids had become unrecognizable to their families.
She was like a stranger to me.
Controlled by an unlikely but powerful puppet master.
This Charles Manson, this Mephistophelian guru type, who was very charismatic, very intelligent.
35-year-old ex-convict Charles Manson commanded an unerring devotion from his hippie disciples. They would kill seemingly at his whim.
He did control them, and when he said jump, they jumped.
The name Charles Manson would become synonymous with evil. But who was this diminutive guru? And how was he able to convince his young devotees to commit frenzied, bloody murder? Over 2 nights in August 1969, actress Sharon Tate and 6 others had been slain in one of the century's most infamous crimes. The killers were a group of young, seemingly middle-class flower children, acting on behalf of their spiritual leader, 35-year-old ex-convict Charles Manson. But just who was this powerful guru?
Manson was to have been born as an unwanted, illegitimate child of a young prostitute.
Disowned at birth, pretty much, raised by relatives.
He grew up in some very tight situation.
It's been claimed that Manson's mother once tried to sell her infant son to a childless waitress in return for a pitcher of beer.
From an early age, he was left to his own devices, got involved in delinquent/criminal activities.
When you grow up on the street, particularly if you're short and slight, like Manson is, you have to be able to learn how to read people very, very quickly and determine who you can get over on and who you can't. And Manson was excellent at that.
From the mid-1940s onwards, a raft of thefts and armed robberies would see the young Manson pass through several institutions where he was said to be sexually brutalized.
What comes through, certainly looking at all the psychiatrist reports and probation reports of Charles Manson, that there was heaps of potential there. But something had happened early in life. And this dogged him the whole time. He felt he'd been dealt a bad hand.
By the 1950s, in his rare periods of freedom, Manson expanded his criminal repertoire to include pimping young women from a Hollywood apartment.
The qualities that a pimp has to entrap, intimidate, extort, run the life of their prostitutes, rent them out, sell them, and so forth. Those are qualities that stood Manson well in his future criminal career.
Incarcerated again in 1960 and facing a lengthy sentence, Manson began to study new ways of thinking.
When he was in Terminal Island, there was a Scientologist. Manson picked up on this, and he did 150 hours of auditing, which is the Scientology term for counselling. And Manson started writing songs. What he was doing, which is quite revolutionary for the time, he started imbuing these songs with much of the philosophies that he was picking up from Scientology and also from his observations of human nature. So I think certainly Manson, at that point, he's actually left the persona of the petty criminal and he's coming into his own.
There's a time for living.
Fellow convict Phil Kaufman would encounter Manson in early 1967.
I was arrested importing, smuggling, if you will, so a little bit of weed from Mexico. I was convicted in Arizona and sent to Terminal Island, California, where my first day in the yard, I heard this guy playing guitar and singing. He sounded a little like Frankie Lane at the time.
Look at your game, girl. What a magic.
I thought the guy was pretty good. The hack, the guard, came up to Charles and said, Manson, you can't play your guitar here. There's a guitar place for playing the guitar. He says, you know, you ain't never gonna get out of here, Manson. And Charlie said, out of where, man? And everybody kept on going, playing this guitar.
Part of the Manson that the public came to know was a very institutionalized person who was used to being told what to do and felt more comfortable in a confined or isolated place.
When you have an individual like Manson who doesn't fear any type of punishment, really, he's a very dangerous individual.
If someone beats you with a whip and you love the whip, what's he doing? He's making a fool out of himself. It's heaven right here, Jack, right here.
Charles Manson had been imprisoned in 1960. When he was eventually released 7 years later, the world was a very different place.
We had just come out of the 50s, where teenagers were basically kept on a very tight leash, and then all of a sudden this wonderful subculture erupted, and we all became free.
The 32-year-old guitar-playing ex-con headed to the eye of the storm.
There were thousands of young people all up and down this street, and this was all the psychedelic scene.
Dr. David Smith founded the neighborhood's famous free medical clinic.
1967 was totally crazy. The streets were jammed. People were taking LSD and dancing and music everywhere. And we had the diggers giving out free food, and it was just a total insanity, and we were in the middle of it. We did a survey of the thousands of kids that came through our clinic, and 98% of them had used LSD.
Charlie saw a good thing when he realized that if somebody ran around and talked like a guru, in that day and age, especially up in San Francisco, you could gather a group of followers in no time.
You're taught that you can't. They even teach you the words. They give you the words. Take all the words away. And don't think in right and wrong, just think in truth.
Among those to fall under Manson's spell were librarian Mary Bruner, disaffected teenager Lynette Fromm, and 19-year-old drifter Susan Atkins.
She had a tough start in life. On top of a broken home, on top of child abuse, Susan Atkins had to suffer the death of her mother from cancer. And she was, come puberty, pretty wild. So wild that her family couldn't contain her. And like many others, she headed off to San Francisco, where she worked variously as a waitress and as a topless go-go dancer. She came across Manson quite early on in the history of the Manson family. And he was able to assume a fatherly role with her, which is a template for what went on with the other girls.
Also joining the group in 1967 would be 20-year-old Patricia Krenwinkel, later renamed by Charlie as Katie.
She had a troubled childhood in as much she suffered from an overt problem with body hair, which, as anyone knows who's come through the teenage thing, that can really screw someone up. And her sister was a heavy drug user. She dominated the family, so Patricia really was a forgotten child.
Patricia Krenwinkel talked about meeting Charlie, and she met him down at the beach, and he took her to an apartment and had her take off all her clothes and look at herself in a full-length mirror and say, "Isn't that the most beautiful thing you've ever seen?"
Pretty, pretty girl. Cease to exist. Just come and say you love me.
And that's it. He got her. She was his after that.
Come on, you can't be.
Like many communal groups of the 60s, Manson and his girls got an old school bus and began roaming California. On his release from prison, Phil Kaufman joined up with the group in Topanga Canyon.
Never learned not to love you.
It was, it was incredible. It was sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Real sex, drugs, and rock and roll. It was sex on demand. It was, I mean, if I just gotten out of prison, and the pretty girls, you just want to get laid, that's a good day at the office. The music was the seduction. He'd get the new girl, some new girl who'd run away. He was good. And the girls would all sit and, play their little instruments, and that usually worked. That was the hook. It got him in.
Phil Kaufman would introduce Manson to a number of music producers, including Doris Day's son, Terry Melcher. Manson hoped to get a major recording contract and introduce his songs to the world.
Remember that a lot of people had not heard this type of music before. And Manson was not that savvy to the industry, media industry, music industry BS at the time. If they said to him, "Charlie, it's brilliant, we love it, we'll be in touch," he believed they meant it.
They may have wore bell-bottom pants, had long hair, but they were businessmen, and Charlie and the family were hippies, and they wanted to do hippie music, and it was just total chaos. It was just, the recording sessions were terrible. But Charlie always kept pursuing a professional recording.
As a child, Manson had been rejected by his mother. Now the LA music industry would do the same.
It became evident to me that there was trouble in paradise.
In 1967, after spending over half his life in institutions, 32-year-old petty criminal Charles Manson had been released into a brave new world. Gathering a small band of admiring followers in San Francisco, Manson and the group began roaming the state, picking up new recruits along the way. In Los Angeles, 16-year-old Barbara Hoyt was just one of many young people they attracted.
He was definitely a father figure to everybody. I admired him. He was a very charismatic person. Everybody gave me lots of attention. They're all very nice to me. I think the acceptance I felt was a very strong draw, and I think that was probably one of the main draws to the cult, to probably anybody.
Within a few weeks, Barbara would move with her new family to a run-down film set in the hills outside Los Angeles, a location that would become infamous.
Oh, man. It's a heavy feeling here. It was just such evil that came out of here. It's such a pretty place. My God. I can smell the same smell of those trees. I can see where the ranch was down in front of me. Over there was the corral, and back here was the barn, and in front of the barn was the movie set. It just seems so surreal. It's almost like it was a long ago dream instead of reality.
At the ranch, Barbara Hoyt would live among young men and women that within months would become murderers, including 23-year-old Charles Tex Watson and 20-year-old Leslie Van Houten.
Leslie Van Houten was from Monrovia, and by all accounts, just a really all-American type girl. She was a homecoming princess at Monrovia High School.
She'd come from a family which was affluent, but had broken down. She had sought solace in drugs. She'd also had an affair which resulted in a pregnancy and an abortion. Like most of Manson's women, she was in a vortex, in a void.
Tex was kind of happy-go-lucky. He didn't challenge Charlie for leadership at all. He did what Charlie told him to do.
He came from a solid family background, but something happened, and that, I believe, was drugs. It just took him from a path which was leading to a successful professional life onto a completely different way.
Literally free sex and freedom of sexual relationships was quite attractive to him. Heterosexual relationships to some group orgies.
Always a conspicuous presence would be the young Susan Atkins, by then rechristened by Manson as Sadie.
The first time I met Sadie, I was sitting on the floor, kind of against the wall, and there were people around, and she squatted right in front of me and cut one. I was, whoa. She would do stuff for shock. Though I thought she was great at the time, I thought, you know, just, wow, kind of a free person, you know.
At the ranch, this childlike free spirit was a state of mind the group aspired to.
The philosophy was that everything you learned was wrong, so we're going to erase your mind and make it childlike. But in retrospect, you could see that by doing that, then you could implant your ideas and philosophy.
Any kind of belief system you had, that was considered trash. So people worked on disbelieving things that they'd been taught, unlearning everything you learned in school. So that you'd end up basically having no opinions based on what you were brought up with. You wouldn't have any more values anymore. It's that were given to us by our parents and peers. But everything we did, it was our choice. You know, people gave up their egos willingly.
Whenever people convert to a new political philosophy or a new religion, a new way of life, it's not because some Svengali or some powerful evangelist or some powerful malevolent figure such as Manson was so strong in the way they came on and so articulate that they instantly converted people. It's always an interactive process.
They needed him to be a father-like figure, a guru, and they created that for themselves. Manson needed followers. Manson needed people to listen to him. And so they both got what they each needed from each other.
But not everyone would find Charles Manson and his philosophies irresistible.
Charles and I drove up to San Francisco, just the two of us. It was at that time when the philosophy of the hippies was, do your own thing, man. You know, don't let the man get you, do your own thing. And I kept saying that, and Charlie kept saying, no, you're not doing your own thing. And I go, yeah, man, you're like, I was like old hippy dippy at the time, It was then that he realized that I wasn't programming. And then it was after we got back for a while, and I said, Charlie, I gotta go. He said, yeah, you're still thinking, aren't you? And I said, yeah, I'm still thinking.
Manson's feelings of power were growing. In 1968, Dr. David Smith's medical clinic studied the group at Spahn's ranch.
I really thought that he was delusional and borderline psychotic. He did refer to himself as God.
He just hung his arms out, and bow his head, and we know what he meant. Charlie would talk about how he was Jesus and the devil all in one, and all men were, but he was more the epitome of it. He certainly said that they killed me, they killed me on a cross 2,000 years ago and didn't do an effing bit of good.
In the summer of 1969, Manson would take playing God to the ultimate extreme. In the isolated ranch in the mountains above Los Angeles, surrounded by his band of loyal disciples, the man who'd spent more than half his life in jail would begin preaching an Armageddon gospel he called Helter Skelter.
He explained to me about Helter Skelter. It's a racist philosophy, basically, but he explained it to me like, would God want all the flowers to be the same color? And, he made it seem like something very pretty.
Helter Skelter came out of one of the Beatles songs, the words. But what it came to mean to Manson and what he was preaching, so to speak, to his followers was a race war.
We had the Watts riots, and so, as far as I was concerned, he was just saying the obvious.
Anytime the word black was mentioned, his hackles would go up, because he'd been in prison and he saw that, how it was between whites and blacks.
He says the black man was going to win this war, but he said black, he only knows what whitey's told him to do. And they're not going to be able to handle the reins of power, so they're going to have to turn over the reins to those white people who had survived Helter Skelter, i.e. Charles Manson and his family. Then he said, we're going to come out of the bottomless pit, and we'll take over the leadership of the world.
Charlie wanted to have his own 12 tribes of Israel, basically, out there in the desert. And he planned for a whole civilization, so it was quite a grand design.
Did Manson believe what he was telling them about the apocalypse coming? No, he didn't believe that at all. I would be amazed if he actually believed that. This was a show. This was totally a performance that Manson put on. Manson is not mentally ill. He's not psychotic. He's manipulative and narcissistic and psychopathic, but he's not mentally ill, and neither were the followers mentally ill.
The end of the world's a good draw. A lot of churches preach that.
By the middle of the year, the atmosphere at the ranch began to change significantly.
The intensity level was noticeable, like Helter Skelter is coming down, like now.
Manson's world was beginning to unravel. Unknown to Barbara Hoyt, in May, during a drug deal gone wrong, Charles Manson had shot a dealer he believed to be a member of the militant Black Panther group.
We started having guards at the ranch, hiding in the haystack and various places. They had field phones laid out between the front of the ranch and the back of the ranch. Then the Black Panthers were going to come for us. Charlie was getting pretty panicky and intense and high-strung and frightened.
At the same time, the LA County Sheriff's Department were beginning to take notice of the strange group.
We had attempted to run some undercover officers in there to try to buy narcotics because they were dealing, doing a lot of things. Never had one bit of success because they just would not accept a stranger.
Charlie had family members up here on the hill watching the cops watch us. Yeah. So we were all watching each other. It was all fun. Considered it fun.
We eventually arrested Charlie, a couple of his female friends, and we took him to Malibu Sheriff Station and booked him. While we were interviewing Charlie, we were notified by desk personnel that somebody had come into the station to try to bail him out. And I asked who it was, and they gave me a name. And the name was Gary Hinman. Didn't mean anything to us. But when I repeated that name to Charlie, he got all squirrely with us.
Detective Salerno could never have known that Gary Hinman would soon become the first murder victim of the Manson family. In July 1969, Manson and his followers attempted to extort money and property from Hinman. When he refused to cooperate, Manson family associate Bobby Beausoleil took action.
When Hinman basically said, "You're nuts, I'm not giving anything to you," so they killed him. They stabbed him and then they smothered him with a pillow.
Allegedly to place suspicion for the murder on the Black Panther political group, slogans were daubed on the wall in blood, along with a panther paw print. The murder attracted little attention, but in less than a month's time, the family would commit a crime that would make the world sit up and take notice.
My own personal feeling is the motive for the killing was a series of events which chipped away at Manson's dominion. There was no record deal. People were leaving the family. People were questioning Manson's ability to be this self-proclaimed messiah. There was chinks appearing, and the last weapon in his armory was Helter Skelter.
On August the 8th, 1969, Manson launched a series of crimes he hoped would be blamed on the black community.
I remember the night that he had called Tex, and I remember looking at them as they were talking, and it was almost like a black cloud was around them. It was dark. And he told me to take the other younger girls to a place called the Wiki Up. And he ordered me to do it. He didn't ask me, he ordered me. I was a good half-mile down the road. There was a back house way back there. And Sadie had called me on the field phone and told me to bring 3 sets of dark clothes up to the front of the ranch. I showed up with the clothes and Charlie snapped at me, wanted to know what I was doing at the front of the ranch when he told me to do something else. And I told him that Sadie had asked me to bring the 3 sets of clothes. And he told me, no, they already left.
Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, Tex Watson, and newcomer Linda Kasabian were headed to the former home of record producer Terry Melcher, now being rented by director Roman Polanski and his actress wife Sharon Tate.
They cut the telephone wires, climbed over the fence, got in through an open window, and it was hell.
On entry to the property, former All-American high school kid Tex Watson was reported to tell its residents, "I am the devil, and I've come to do the devil's business."
These people I knew and slept with and loved are now heinous murderers. They were vicious. I mean, just horrible killings. I mean, it's multiple stabbing while people are begging for their lives. These people who I've known, you know, made love to, are now they're killing people. I mean, boing, what a flip. Complete flip.
For Manson, he had no empathy or emotional attachment to any of these people.
The victims died in the worst way. Frykowski was beaten over the head numerous times. There were huge gashes in his head. We believe This is the weapon that Tex used to kill him. Patricia Krenwinkel chased Abigail Folger across the lawn, and poor Abigail was screaming and running for her life. This is not a nice way to die.
Patricia Krenwinkel, her only complaint is that the knife went down to the bone and started hurting her hand. It went so far down. Susan Atkins told me that Sharon said, "Please let me live so I can have my baby." And Susan told Sharon, "Look, bitch, I don't have any mercy on you. You're gonna die." So they got rid of all their bloody clothing, put on their regular clothing, and they threw the bloody clothing over the side of a hill, and they went back to the ranch. Manson spoke to them, and they went to bed.
They slept in. Everybody slept in the next morning, but the next afternoon, I went into Johnny Schwartz's trailer, and I was just sitting back and watching the Hobo Kelly in the afternoon, and Sadie came in, and by that was about 5 or 6, wanted me to turn the channel to the news. She told me to call Tex, and I called Tex. He came to the trailer, and so did a couple other people, and they all sat on Johnny Schwartz's couch there and watched the news. The first thing that came on was the Sharon Tate murders. So now I knew that murders had occurred there. I had no idea, no clue whatsoever that I was sitting amongst the murderers. Someone said, picked a good one or something like that, because it made the first story. And they laughed. They thought that was funny. And I remember when I watched the TV, when I was watching the TV, it scared me. You know, it scared me, and I was thinking, wow, I'm not in that world. That's good. Well, you know, I had no idea how much in it I was.
That night, the people Barbara Hoyt counted as her friends would go hunting again.
There was no one safe in this whole county that night.
On August the 9th, 1969, the so-called Manson family had slain actress Sharon Tate and 4 others in a bloody, terror-filled home invasion. And the nightmare was not yet over.
When they went down looking for victims the second night, there was no one in LA. There was no one in this whole city that was safe. They were going to break into a church and kill the pastor and hang him from the cross in there, but the church was locked because it was at night.
Those eventually chosen to die were 44-year-old supermarket executive Lino LaBianca and his 38-year-old wife, Rosemary.
Manson had driven in the car with them, finally picked out this house. He told them that last night, meaning at the Tate Mansion, they had botched it by almost letting a couple of them escape and not killing them efficiently. So he didn't want that to happen again. So he said, "You wait here, I'll go into the house." He went in and tied them both up, then went back out, told them it's okay now, you can go in and kill them. And then he drove off.
The LaBiancas were trussed up literally like a couple of hogs at slaughter, and then they were slaughtered. These were brutal, violent, terrible murders.
Leslie Van Houten told Diane Lake that stabbing Rosemary LaBianca was fun. The more she did it, the more she enjoyed it.
This fork was the fork that Patricia Krenwinkel used to carve war in the abdomen of Lino LaBianca after he was killed, and then stuck it into his chest. When the body was found, it had this fork sticking out of it.
I mean, it's nightmarish. It's nightmarish.
Among words written in the victim's blood was the phrase, Helter Skelter.
Tex told me that they'd gone to a love-in, and for me not to mention it. And I was kind of jealous because my dad would never let me go to a love-in. That wasn't 11, they were killing the LaBiancas. Yeah, the whole thing just makes me shake.
Over the course of 2 bloody nights, Manson's followers had taken the lives of 7 unsuspecting victims, seemingly without conscience. Even through their subsequent arrest and trial, most of Manson's entourage would remain unswervingly loyal to him.
Everything that Charlie did, they did. If Charlie said something, they would parrot him. If Charlie put an X on his forehead, they'd come to court the next morning with an X's on their foreheads. If he put a swastika on there, by God, the swastika was there the next morning.
Only a few, including Barbara Hoyt, would testify against the man they once thought of as divine. So what had driven so many to willfully engage in such brutal and bloody crimes? Was murder in their nature? Were Manson and his young followers born to kill?
I couldn't say that Manson was born coming out of the womb to kill people, but I think that his upbringing was so bad that I don't doubt for 1 minute that it were not conducive to a good life, a well-rounded life. And I guess maybe he just wanted to make everybody miserable. That's the only theory I could ever really come up with.
I don't even think he was thinking of murder when he first formed this family, but it was a slow evolutionary process. And I think at some point he saw that he could get them to do anything he wanted them to do. And he had this enormous hostility for society.
I know Charlie was treated horribly as a child, you know, between the neglect and abuse he suffered.
I don't think that he attracted kids who were predisposed to kill people. I'd hate to think that the whole group of them were natural-born killers. I just don't think that's the case.
Do I think these women, had they not met Manson, would have gone on to kill somebody? No, I don't believe that. There's no indication that that would have happened. Manson now is a different story. Whether he killed somebody in his past or didn't, it's really unclear and in dispute, but he certainly has the capability of doing that. But from Manson's perspective, if he could get you to kill the person for him, he'd much prefer to have you do it, because in his mind, it's absolving him then of direct criminal responsibility. He's always working the system and working other people, Manson. Nothing is by chance. It's all planned, and he is a highly controlling individual.
I know when I interviewed Susan Atkins, she said she was in death row for 5 years before Charlie left her brain, and that he had absolute control over her thoughts, and they believed he could read their minds. I think what you had was a delusional leader coupled with psychedelic drugs, an alienated population of young people, and an environment that reinforced it.
I describe it as a gradual desensitization and conditioning process. And he, throughout his life, had stolen cars, committed robberies, and many other state and federal crimes. And he had these people, had them do these same kinds of things. We all can have the capacity to say no. Just say no.
Charlie, I think he was made into a monster by his upbringing, but he still had a choice. So I don't think it's just nature versus nurture. I think we all have a choice and a responsibility to determine our own fates. The only thing I can think of that's different between me and those, I have some empathy for the victims. They didn't seem to care. They don't care. I've had a real hard time. Oh, so here I go. I've never gotten past what they did.
In the mid-1970s, New York City was plunged into terror.
I can't tell you what effect this series of crimes had on the city of New York. People in the area lived in a great deal of fear.
Innocent young couples were being slayed on the streets.
There was no rhyme or rhythm or reason. Had no idea where it was going to pop up next.
Literally, everybody who walked the streets were terrified.
The killer called himself the Son of Sam.
When he got the urge to kill, he would scan the streets of the city of New York.
But what made him murder? Was he warped by his experiences?
This was a terribly, pathetically lonely young man.
Or was the Son of Sam born to kill?
These individuals are hardwired so that their killing is part of their sexual arousal pattern.
It's changed. This used to be a park house that's somewhere in the middle over here before they renovated this park years back.
In the summer of 1977, after meeting just a week earlier, 20-year-olds Robert Violante and Stacy Moskowitz were out on their first date.
We had gone out to a movie first, and then we drove over here to where we're sitting now. We came out into the park. It was a summer night. It was nice out, and we felt like two little kids. I said, "How about we let's go for playing a swing for a little while." When I had walked by the park, I had just saw some guy hanging out, and didn't think anything of it. And then we had gone into my car. We sat in my car, and then the next thing, all I remember was hearing a couple of loud noises, like bangs. The first thing I had heard was a moan coming from Stacy. No, I couldn't see her because I was totally blinded. Something clicked in my head that we must have been shot. Oh my God. We're dead.
The attack was to be the final chilling act of the most notorious killer in New York's history. The 29th of July, 1976, 1 year earlier. 18-year-old Donna Laurie and her friend, 19-year-old Jody Valenti, are sitting in a parked car, talking after a night out. A man approaches, draws a gun, and fires 3 times. Donna is killed almost instantly, but Jody survives and can describe the shooter.
In most police departments, they have what they call a sketch artist. And in these particular incidents, the survivors of these shootings, we got sketches.
The gunman was a stocky white male with curly or bushy hair. And crucially, unlike most New York homicides, he had no known connection to the victim. Over the following winter months of 1976, there would be 2 further unprovoked shootings, injuring 4 more victims, this time in the borough of Queens.
The memory of the case is seared in my memory for all time, like all other New Yorkers who were around at that time. These killings began as sort of random events.
There was no rhyme or rhythm or reason.
However, there were similarities between the crimes.
Many of the shootings took place in dark lovers' lane areas where, young people might be parking, and a man would approach and open fire.
Clearly a serial sexual murder in my judgment. Take a look at who he's shooting. He's shooting women. He's shooting them in lovers' lanes. These individuals are hardwired so that their behavior, their killing, is part of their sexual arousal pattern. That's why they repeat it, because it is so sexually arousing and sexually stimulating.
On the 30th of January 1977, another shooting. Detective Sergeant Joseph Coffey was assigned to the case.
I was called in to investigate a homicide that occurred in Queens County. It was the homicide of a girl named Christine Freund, and she was sitting in a car with a boyfriend.
26-year-old Christine and her boyfriend John had returned to their car after a night out, when without warning, a gunman opened fire.
And it was a brutal killing. She was shot in the head several times.
As with the first 3 attacks, the shooter was unknown to the victims and had immediately fled the scene of the crime. The evidence began to point to a serial killer.
It became apparent that the same weapon, a .44 caliber revolver, was being used in all of the killings.
But ballistics results were inconclusive.
Ballistics of the bullets involved did not match because of the nature of the type of gun that was used. It was a .44 caliber Charter Arms Bulldog. That gun was fashioned for sky marshals, and the gun was of such a nomenclature that it was made that you could fire it from within an aeroplane and not penetrate the fuselage. So that means the ballistics of the bullet coming out of the gun was limited.
5 weeks later, just 1 street away, the gun was used again. "19-year-old student Virginia Voskerichian was found dead.
She was shot in the street by an unknown perpetrator who came up to her and fired at her, and she had put her school books up in front of her, and the bullet went through the school books and lodged in her brain. We were able to compare the bullet that we recovered from her skull to the original shooting that we took from the body of Donald Laurier. Because we were able to do that, we were able to determine that we had a serial killer.
Five attacks had left 3 dead and 4 injured, and now news spread that a serial killer was stalking the streets of New York.
People were afraid to go out. It was a terrifying experience.
I mean, it was a time where one man could terrorize an entire city of 8 million people. Literally everybody who walked the streets, particularly women, were terrified.
But the mystery killer's reign of terror had only just begun. In early 1977, the citizens of New York had been plunged into panic by the news that a serial killer was loose on their streets. 5 attacks had already left 3 dead and 4 wounded. And in the early hours of the 17th of April, the killer struck again. Detective Joseph Coffey is called to the Bronx.
That shooting, he killed 2 people, a boy and a girl in a car, again, having a liaison in the car, and he came up and killed both of them.
20-year-old Alexander Esau and 18-year-old Valentina Siriani had both been shot twice. As usual, the killer had fled the scene. But this time, there was a twist.
In the shooting in the Bronx, a letter was left. The letter was addressed to Captain Joseph Borelli, who was working the case with me.
In part, the letter read, "I am a monster. I am the son of Sam. I look out the attic window and watch the world go by. I feel like an outsider. I'm on a different wavelength than everybody else. Programmed to kill." Although police didn't know it, it had been written by a 23-year-old resident of an apartment block in Yonkers, David Richard Berkowitz. So who was this hunter who called himself the son of Sam? And had he, as he claimed, been programmed to kill?
His past life had a significant bearing, I believe, on whom his victims were.
David Berkowitz was born Richard David Falco on the 1st of June 1953. The result of an extramarital affair, he was immediately given up for adoption to childless couple Nathan and Pearl Berkowitz.
The Berkowitzes doted on their adopted son, but Berkowitz was very much like his adoptive parents socially in that he was isolated and quite lonely. He had very poor social skills and was regarded in the Bronx community where he was brought up as a bit of a bully and a loner.
The young Berkowitz would have sudden outbursts of anger and violence, leading to his adoptive parents taking him to a psychiatrist.
Of interest is that he always had tried to belong in his school. He didn't fit. He was kind of a loner, but not in the sense that you would be worried about him. He had no behavior problems, but he also had no friends that he felt close to.
Throughout his adolescence, there is no recorded incidents of Berkowitz having a girlfriend. It's interesting to speculate that his choice of targets are usually young women or young courting women who are in the company of their boyfriend might be seen as a way of Berkowitz acting out his inability to establish his own form of relationship with a girlfriend.
At 14 years old, Berkowitz would be devastated by the death of his adoptive mother, Pearl, from breast cancer.
This seems to have been a crisis in his life. His grades at school will dive, he loses his faith in God, and so forth. And especially the kind of underlying problems that Berkowitz, the adult, is going to show are going to become exacerbated when his adoptive father remarries and he does not get on with his new stepmother, and his feelings of being isolated, of women abandoning him, become more and more exacerbated.
At 18, he joins the army.
He went off into the service, spent a year in Korea, spent a year in no uncertain terms of just getting intoxicated on drugs every single day.
After serving overseas, Berkowitz was then posted back to the US, stationed in Virginia.
No drugs anymore, and instead we have a very, very lonely young man, not knowing what to do with himself, who finds himself in the midst of a very intense Baptist region. And in the fullness of time, he converts. But this is not somebody who really has found God, but really of wanting to be accepted and loved by others. This was a terribly, pathetically lonely young man.
Disillusioned with army life, Berkowitz quits and returns to New York. He makes contact with his natural mother, who reveals the circumstances of his birth and adoption.
He found out who his real parents were. It turned out his mother's married name was Italian, and that the man by whom she had fathered the child was Jewish. They had an extramarital affair. And this, I think, plays a direct role in whom he was watching, which couples he sought out. They were either Italian or Jewish. And he would later write this, or say this, that he was in effect displacing his resentment at his parents, real parents, for having had him and then put him up for adoption, that is, as he would view it, abandoned him.
Living alone in New York, Berkowitz finds work as a security guard and a taxi driver. He develops an obsession for starting fires.
Berkowitz set 1,488 fires before he started killing people. How do we know that? He documented it very carefully in his diary.
No real intent for damage, but to be able to call out for help or for succor or support by turning in a fire alarm and watching the fire engines come out. That's what he was so seeking of some kind of external response.
These fires, in my judgment, were sexually motivated as well, because look at the power and control that you can have by setting a fire. You could set a building on fire, a car, a field. And for these individuals, that type of control is eroticized. It's sexually stimulating to them to do that type of thing.
In 1976, Berkowitz moved to a top-floor apartment in Yonkers, New York. Neighbors began to notice strange incidents.
There was many dogs being killed, primarily German Shepherds. It seemed like every day a dead dog would turn up in the neighborhood, either here, back in the woods behind the house, in the woods at this end of the house, or the woods over at that end. And fires, frequent fires in this area, including the same apartment number in the various buildings, 1, 2, and 3. The house you can see far back there, apartment building, almost took off the whole corner of the building.
One neighbor in particular was singled out for special attention.
David Berkowitz lived in the back far corner of the building, and if you look down, you would see a street that was on, that Sam Carr's house was on. Sam Carr had a black Labrador that lived in the backyard in a doghouse.
Sam Carr's dog would bark incessantly through the night. Berkowitz began writing anonymous threatening letters to Sam, eventually shooting and injuring the dog.
He has underlying mental health problems in which it's not a question of switching on and switching off those mental health problems. It's a question of his disordered thinking is actually what patterns his consistent behavior day in, day out.
In June 1976, David Berkowitz travels to Texas and pays a surprise call on a former Army acquaintance, Bill Parker.
Berkowitz showed up unexpectedly at his house and said, "I'd like to buy a weapon, but in Texas you need a driver's license to buy a weapon." So Parker accommodated him and went into a pawn shop. Berkowitz pointed out the .44 caliber Charter Arms revolver, and Parker bought it, and then he gave it to Berkowitz, not knowing that a few weeks later the Son of Sam killings would begin in New York City.
By the spring of 1977, Berkowitz had claimed the lives of 5 young people. But his reign of terror was far from over. By April of 1977, serial killer, the Son of Sam, had claimed the lives of 5 victims and injured more in a series of attacks that had sent shockwaves through the city of New York. On the 19th of April, in an effort to quell the growing hysteria and track down the killer, police established the Omega Task Force.
Operation Omega was the task force set up for the purpose of capturing him in the act of one of his shootings. We combined the detective forces, which were investigators from all over New York City, with the patrol force, which were the uniform cops in New York City, to the point where we had 300 to 400 detectives and uniform patrols on the streets of New York, particularly in the boroughs of Queens and the Bronx, looking to catch this individual in the act of committing his crimes.
On the 30th of May, while hundreds of officers were trying to track him down, the son of Sam spoke out again, this time writing to the New York Daily News. The letter began, "Hello from the gutters of New York City, which are filled with dog manure, vomit, stale wine, urine and blood. Hello from the sewers of New York City, which swallow up these delicacies when they are washed away by the sweeper trucks. Hello from the cracks in the sidewalks of New York City, and from the ants that dwell in these cracks and feed on the dried blood of the dead." It continued, "I am still here, like a spirit roaming the night, thirsty, hungry, seldom stopping to rest, anxious to please Sam."
These individuals are very often highly narcissistic, and it's not unusual at all for them to want publicity, to follow the publicity in the media, and to get some sort of stimulation as a result of that, because in their mind, they think that they're smarter than the police, they're smarter than everybody.
People were very nervous, apprehensive. They saw ghosts in all the shadows. Girls cut their hair, long hair that made it short, changed the color. The nightclubs, bars, dance halls, all losing business. Streets were empty. Everybody was just terrified.
Night after night, a massive task force patrolled the streets across New York and staked out lovers' lanes. But no one knew if, when or where the killer might strike again. On June the 26th, they found out.
As soon as we got here, we knew it was the son of Sam. It was a hot summer night, 1977, and that particular night I got a call over the air that a shooting occurred at this location, which occurred right up the block here. 2 young people in the car, both shot. Discotheque here with hundreds of young people inside. Patrol cars all over the place, a scene of panic, people in the streets. The uniformed police responded, cordoned off the area. We conducted our forensic investigation, and we also canvassed the area of witnesses.
Although injured, both victims survived and were able to describe the attack.
As both people come out of the club, went into the car, he showed up exactly like he did in prior occasions, 2 people making out in the car, and he come up behind them and fired into the car, firing at the girl and hit the male also.
Stalking, hiding up, trying to catch lovers unawares would be very much part of what would give a sexual thrill. He's invading a space which should be private.
So far, all the attacks had taken place in the boroughs of Queens or the Bronx, and most of the female victims targeted had had long dark hair. It was on the 31st of July 1977 when 20-year-old Robert Violante had set out for his first date with the young girl he'd met a week earlier.
The night before, I was out in one of our local nightclubs that we hung out in all the time. And I was standing outside in front, just getting some air with a buddy of mine. And I had said to Louis, I said, Louis, you ever hear the expression, you feel it in your bones, you got that gut wrenching feeling? I said, Louis, I just have it in my gut that he's gonna either hit Brooklyn tonight or tomorrow night, meaning Saturday night. I just knew it, I just felt it. The next night, that same feeling was like 1,000,000 miles away from me. Had no feeling at all. But I won't forget leaving my house, and as I was walking down the stairs, my mom turned to me and said, Robert, just be careful. And I turned to her and I said, you know, I said, don't worry, nothing's gonna, I said, she's a blonde.
Later that night, Robert and Stacy were sitting in his parked car when 3 shots rang out.
The bullet entered directly into my eye and came straight across. And, you know, I lost the left eye, it destroyed everything on the left side, and it did a lot of damage on my right eye.
20-year-old Stacy had also been hit in the head.
So instinctively, I remember that right outside my door was a lamppost. Just came out, and I guess I wrapped it around this way, and this hand, my right hand, went into ringing the horn. I knew to get attention, and I was just screaming at the same time, help us, we've been shot, we've been shot.
The young couple were rushed to hospital. Robert lost one eye and most of the sight in the other. 36 hours after the attack, Stacy Moskowitz was pronounced dead.
I felt terrible. I really did. She was such a sweet girl. Even though I had only met her on my first date, I just knew she was a very, very sweet girl.
It was the first time the son of Sam had struck in Brooklyn. Detective Ed O'Sullivan was assigned to the case.
The homicide squad in Brooklyn during that homicide was so positive. They were up. They were, we're gonna get him. You can just feel it. I said, you came to the wrong place, buddy.
A few days later, an eyewitness came forward. They had spotted a suspicious-looking man near the scene of the crime. They described how he looked agitated after receiving a parking ticket. The Brooklyn detectives traced the ticket and vehicle.
Was registered to David Berkowitz with an address in Yonkers.
The name of the car owner was one they had seen before amongst thousands of tip-offs.
A company called IBI had some information about a guy named Berkowitz who worked for them, who was a bit of a nut job. You ought to look into him. So we started to look into him. Also at that time, we got an individual who called us and came into our office by the name of Sam Carr, who said to us, I have a lunatic who lives near me. He shot my dog, and his name is David Berkowitz. And then we have the parking violation ticket on the car at the scene of the killing of Stacy Moskowitz. 2 + 2 + 2 equals David Berkowitz.
On the 10th of August, Police assembled in Yonkers.
It was a hot summer day, and it was unusual in the sense that this is a very quiet neighborhood. Commonly, you see a police car out here on occasion. This day, there was a conglomerate of them. They were up and down the street this way, one right in front of my house, and on the street far up there, there was about 4 or 5 of them. David Berkowitz came out of the building, seemingly oblivious to the world, and walked to his car, which went right over about where that silver car is, right over there. As soon as he opened the door, he got into his car, they surrounded him.
At that time, the 2 detectives got out of the car. One name was John Filatico, the other one was Sergeant Gardella. Filatico went up to the driver's side of the car. Berkowitz was already in the car. He had his gun out, and he said, "Put your hands on the dashboard and don't move." Berkowitz turned to Detective Filatico and said, "You got me." Filatico says to him, "Who do I have?" He says, "You have the son of Sam." And on the seat in the car that he was sitting in was a paper bag. In that paper bag was the .44 caliber gun that did all of the shootings.
He was done in by a parking ticket. Had that parking ticket not been placed on his vehicle, I don't know how many other people he would have shot or killed before he was apprehended.
Once in custody, Berkowitz would make an extraordinary claim.
He got messages because the dog spoke to him. And when the dog spoke to him, according to Berkowitz, relaying the message from the devil, it was time to kill. That's when he went out and killed.
In August of 1977, 24-year-old David Berkowitz admitted he was the son of Sam, a serial killer who had terrorized the streets of New York for a year.
The night he was caught, there was all sorts of celebrations. They were giving away drinks in all the bars.
With Berkowitz in custody, investigators would now try to discover what had motivated his crimes. Interviewing him for the first time, Detective Sergeant Joseph Coffey could never have predicted Berkowitz's explanation.
We spoke to him about each killing, how he did it, in detail from A to Z. For 3 hours, he sat there and he never blinked his eyes and he had a constant smile on his face. And he went through chapter and verse of every shooting and killing that he did from the first one to the night we captured him. He told us that his motivation was his connection to the devil. The devil told him to kill these women. The devil told him when to do it, and the devil communicated to him through the dog that belonged to Sam Carr. He felt that the devil had a power over him, and he had to go out and do the devil's bidding.
He was being compelled. He was told to go out and seek victims. When he killed a young lady, she would be possessed and used by these ulterior forces, but at the end of a year, he could then have the young lady.
Quite clearly, he's paranoid, and quite clearly, he's also schizophrenic. So I think what's driving David Berkowitz is ultimately the voices he hears in his head telling him to satisfy those voices, he needs to take other people's lives.
When Berkowitz told us that he was doing these killings and these shootings at the behest of the devil, we looked at each other that we are definitely dealing with a lunatic here.
The judge ordered that a competency hearing be held with respect to Berkowitz. Now, this is common, of course, in any case where the court suspects mental illness.
There was what we called the insanity plea, where if you had a severe mental illness and you didn't appreciate your wrongfulness of your conduct, you would be found essentially not guilty by reason of insanity.
Dr. Daniel Schwartz was asked to assess Berkowitz's mental state.
At the time I examined him for the court, I and my associate studied him many, many hours. It was to see whether or not he was able to face his criminal charges, or conversely, whether or not he was so overwhelmed by mental illness that it prevented him from rationally addressing his charges.
You have to ask the question, would they have actually abducted the victim if there was a police officer or two standing around? And the answer is no, because they didn't want to get arrested. So they can control it to some degree, but they choose not to control it.
Of course, he was mentally ill to do this. Whether or not he was legally responsible, probably in retrospect, probably, because he chose darkness in which to commit the crimes, and he invariably left the crime scene, suggesting by his behavior that he knew that what he was doing was wrong.
Berkowitz's modus operandi was very simple. When he got the urge to kill, he would scan the streets of the city of New York, and he would drive around looking for an opportunity to kill.
He went at times to appropriate places where he knew that a couple would drive to have a little privacy and to be romantic.
He wasn't a process-focused killer. In other words, he didn't enjoy being in the company of his victims, torturing his victims, staying with his victims. He was an act-processed serial killer. In other words, what he wanted to achieve was simply the death of his victims. Because he was a hit-and-run killer, often showing just a great deal of random behavior, it was much more difficult for the police to be able to catch him.
Although Berkowitz had confessed to the attacks, there were fears that a trial might see him found not guilty by reason of insanity.
After several weeks, he told me that he was feeling increasingly depressed, regretful, guilty for what he had done.
Berkowitz was allowed to consult with a preacher.
There was a Baptist woman. She saw him, and I'll never forget what happened. She saw him alone. He would ask her a question. She would then talk to God. God would then ostensibly answer her, and she would repeat the answer to David. And when they came out an hour later, she went on her way. He walked down the hall towards me. He had this incredible glow on his face that he had just met God again. And so he came out of this informing me and his attorneys that he was going to plead guilty. And nothing could change his mind. Attorneys spent hours with him. I was present several times, trying to convince him to plead insanity.
On the 5th of August 1978, Berkowitz appeared in court.
Everybody was surprised when Berkowitz walked into court, and instead of demanding a trial, he pled guilty to everything. And so the biggest case in the United States, the most highly publicized serial killer in the United States, suddenly pled guilty, and that was pretty much the end of the case.
On the 6th of December, Berkowitz was sentenced to a total of 365 years in prison. So what made Berkowitz murder? Was it the discovery of his adoption? Was it his unstable and isolated life? Or was the son of Sam simply born to kill?
He was not born to kill. In the sense of, can you say that there is a definite urge there to do it? He had the genetic makeup, yes. But the genetics was added onto by the environment. It was added onto by his maturing into his adolescent years, where the brain function starts to work on the gene, and then you have all of the beginning fantasies to kill.
So we've got a great deal of anger in his life about adoptive mothers who will die and therefore leave him, stepmothers coming into his life that he doesn't like. So these are the patterns of behavior that make David Berkowitz the killer that he became. But was he born to kill? I don't think David Berkowitz was born to kill. I think how he was socialized over a long period of time turned him into a killer.
I think a compelling case could be made that Berkowitz was born to kill. I think that there are certain kinds of mental illness that are hardwired into people. I mean, I think the more neurologists study the brain, the more they find that the presence of certain chemicals in the brain and the way they operate can compel people to engage in certain activities. And it seems clear to me that he suffered from severe mental illness and that mental illness drove him to kill.
What it is not is a result of poor parenting or some watershed event that happens in someone's life. There's thousands and thousands of people that have been adopted and don't do anything even close to what Berkowitz did. Berkowitz is a serial sexual murderer, and these individuals murder because there's a fusion of sex and aggression so that the aggressive act itself is eroticized. It's sexually stimulating for them. That's why they repeat it, because it is so sexually arousing and sexually stimulating. A number of people have said the overwhelming majority of serial sexual murderers kill up close and personal. Very, very rarely do they shoot somebody. Therefore, how do you explain David Berkowitz falling within that category? But you have to look at the first victim. The first victim that Berkowitz tried to kill was a woman, and he did it with a knife, except he didn't kill her. And so he then reverted to a method of killing that he was most comfortable with.
Psychiatrist Dr. Daniel Schwartz, who had examined David Berkowitz after his capture, would later receive a letter from prison.
He wrote me a letter, the substance of which was that all of these statements about God and the demons and so on were malingering, faking. In fact, his letter reads to begin with, quote, "I'm a faker. I made the demon story all up from the beginning. The reason for this was to try to mentally justify and cause for the crimes I committed. I knew there were no real demons, witches, talking dogs, and satanic henchmen. When I started committing these crimes, I had no idea of what motivated me. I decided that the demons as a cause would be appropriate. This is also why I pleaded guilty, because I knew I was."
I mean, what makes a person a killer? I don't know, I'll never understand that totally, But, I don't believe anybody's born like that to have that in them, but I really don't know for sure. All the victims and lives that they destroyed, they're just innocent kids, just all having fun, just all at the prime of their life. And, even the survivors, tremendous trauma, but I hope they're all doing well in their lives. I had never thought about that too much, but I'm saying it now that I just hope they're all doing well.